Today I'm speaking with Pat Farabaugh, an associate professor of the communications department here at St. Francis University. So Pat is coming out with a new book on October 18th. So Pat, could you tell us a little bit about the book that's getting published?
Sure. Well, thanks for the time. It is titled Disastrous Floods and the Demise of Steel in Johnstown. It looks at the three major floods that have hit the city of Johnstown, which is in 1889, a catastrophic flood, and then floods, less loss of life, but still pretty damaging, in 1936 on St. Patrick's Day, and then in July of 1977. It looks at those events, and it also looks at boom and bust periods of the steel industry in the region up until really the giant of the steel industry in this area, Bethlehem Steel, shut down its plants during the 1980s.
So Pat, this isn't your first book. Your other books have varying topics. So what drove you to write about the many disastrous Johnstown floods and the downfall of steel?
My grandfather was a coal miner for Bethlehem Steel. Actually broke his back in the mines, and he would tell us stories about the mining industry. That was one of the catalysts to taking on this topic. I also remember vividly, my mom was a RN nurse, and I still vividly remembered her talking about the flooded roads that she had to try to navigate. And it's just such an important part of our history in this region, Julia. There was a wonderful book by David McCullough on the 1889 flood, but I thought the other two deserved an examination, a historical examination, so that's why I took it on.
So you mentioned a lot about the floods, but when writing your book, you also talk about the steel industry. Which topic did you find more interesting when researching?
Well, when I was looking for a publisher, and I landed with History Press out of Charleston, South Carolina, and initially they weren't the first publisher that I approached. They were willing to include the steel part of it. Another publisher was thinking I should just focus on the floods. But I don't believe the story can be told completely without both of those subject matters, because the people that lived here, the steel industry, it's the giant shadow it casts. There are so many families whose parents or grandparents worked in the steel industry. And this is about really more than the floods. It's about the economic impact of the floods. And that impact was felt by many families with the ups and downs of the steel industry. So they're so intertwined, it was hard to extract one from the other.
You talk so much about havoc from floods, a shadow from the steel industry. What would you describe the mood of your book?
I think it's not uplifting. Johnstown is a part of our state that has really struggled economically to find its footing. And that's not only because of the mills and the mines closing and us going a different direction with products in this country, with aluminums, with plastics, the steel industry. There are many Rust Belt cities that have struggled. And I think it's a fair account of the challenges Johnstown's faced. Johnstown has also been hit hard by the opioid epidemic, and I touch on that in the epilogue of the book. I think it's a fair historical look at the challenges Johnstown has faced. The resilience of the people, that is an uplifting part of the book. I mean, Johnstowners take pride in their community as well they should. They've persevered through a lot. I talk about a lot of those challenges. They've been dealt a difficult hand, and I don't sugarcoat that in the book.
Could you paint me a picture of what you think my town could look like if these floods didn't occur, if the demise of steel didn't occur?
Well, if the demise of steel had not occurred, Johnstown would be a very different place. Johnstown, David McCullough said it, the birthplace, and I'm quoting him, the birthplace of steel can fairly be said to have begun here. He's talking about Johnstown and the Cambria Iron Works. And that's, when you're saying America's steel industry started in this community. So it's steel continued and not faced international competition to the extent that it did if these other substitutes for steel had not emerged. Johnstown would, no reason to believe it wouldn't continue to thrive economically. The other part of your question, if the floods hadn't have happened, the steel industry inevitably was going to change. So I don't think that, yes, the floods impacted the region economically, but the steel industry, the Bethlehem plant specifically, struggled so much. Without floods, Johnstown, I think, would still face a lot of the economic challenges it does today. If steel was continuing to boom, I think Johnstown would have a very different look to it.
That's very interesting, especially as a native. So my lineage actually goes the entire way back to Peter Shantz, Peter Johns, which has his own statue as a founder in the center of Johnstown.
He was decapitated. His statue was
Yes.
decapitated in one of the floods.
Yes. So would you recommend those with a strong lineage in Johnstown to read your book?
My book is for a general audience. It's not for an academic audience. It is for people who want to read about the story of this city, the economic story of the city. Yes, to answer your question, I want everybody to read my book. You spend a lot of time writing a book, and you want everybody to read it. But I do think that even if you're not into the history so much, there's going to be things, especially from people in the region, like you mentioned, your ties to the founder. There's going to be people's names they recognize. People from the region will find some commonality with a lot of the content in the book.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful that you're able to write the book from an audience perspective, including everybody and not specified to a specific target. So for our listeners, is there anything that they should know or that you would like to tell them before they read your book, The Disastrous Floods and the Demise of Steel in Johnstown?
It's available for pre-order on Amazon, so I'll share that. And it is, I think it's an interesting read. I really do. I think that if you have interest in either some of the challenges with regards to the floods, the ebbs and flows of the steel industry, Bethlehem Steel, if any of that is of interest to you, I think you'll find something that piques your curiosity in the book.
Yeah, well, Pat, you did an excellent job describing your book. Everything that your book encompasses, you went very thorough in describing it. So thank you very much for telling me about your book and for spending the time talking to me about it.
Oh, thank you, Julie. I appreciate it.